so I'm very happy to be here, and I'm very happy to be here on this floor with everybody right here. The only person that you don't know is Jawar Mohammed. He's a former terrorist, so if you didn't know about him. All right. What I wanted to talk about, at least the idea for this forum, is that, yes, we are in the midst of transition in this country. The transitions, political transitions, are difficult exercises. What we wanted to do is to try to give some ideas or suggestions as to what needs to be done at this moment, but also to encourage the engagement by intellectuals of the transition. I think the President spoke to that. What we need at this point in time is, as someone told me yesterday, that the Prime Minister of Ethiopia said that if this is really the case, then the engagement of the university community, the engagement of scholars and intellectuals is going to be critical. So that is what we wanted to underscore. Having said that, and this is when my time started, I suppose, yeah, my topic is managing political transitions in Ethiopia, focusing on the element of choice. And my presentation and Jawar's presentations are sequential. He focuses on the structural factors that could be detrimental to transitions, to political transitions, especially transition from authoritarian rule to democracy. I focus on the element of choice. So they are connected, so to speak. There is no doubt that we are in the midst of transition in this country. There is a palpable shift away from an authoritarian regime to democracy. If this transition succeeds, it will be the first time that a political transition, peaceful political transition has occurred in this country. We know from this country's history over the last 100 years, if you remember 1960, there was a palace coup that led to a transition from Menelik to his young son, Iyasu. Transition in 1974 was also a popular uprising, but there was violence in it. Another transition occurred in 1991. That's also a violent transition. A peaceful transfer of power. Peaceful transition has not occurred in this country. But if it does succeed this time, that there's no doubt that it will be the first time this has occurred, and this country deserves a transition, a peaceful transition to a democratic order. The other quality about this transition is not that a regime is replaced by another regime. What I think about this is that the struggle over the last 50 years, so to speak, if we say that the demand for democracy, for equality, for justice in this country commenced in 1968 on this campus, if we assume that is the case, then it is 50 years to the date, 2018, that we are now beginning a political struggle for democracy. Now, missing this event, the one that I outlined, missing the events, not only represented missed opportunities for peaceful transition, but it also valorized violence. It's always been violent in this country. Even since this regime came into power in 1991, we missed three opportunities for political transition. One occurred in 1991 itself. That was an opportunity to redesign the governance of this country, the polity itself, but instead of really using that opportunity to transition, what we did was take a different route to some form of dictatorship. The second occurred in 1998 with the war with Eritrea. That was another moment for political transition, but the conflict was used to eradicate, for the former leader of this country to eradicate political opponents from within the ruling party and to consolidate a personalist rule in this country. Another opportunity, since 1991 was 2005, the May 2005 elections, that plucked political disaster out of the jaws of the victory. So we've missed opportunities even 3 times. This opportunity is very different. The reason that it is different is that because the revolution that ushered in the change that we're celebrating came from below. It's a pressure from below that forced the ruling party to assess itself, to embark on what they call the deep reform, and then deep reform, and then deep reform. Whatever it is, it has caused tremors within the ruling party, and it has, what we see right now is a reformist prime minister or a reformist group of the ruling party that have embarked on the path of transition. So in my presentation, what I try to do as fast as I can is first I want to talk about talk about it within the transition of doctrine, the transition doctrine known as transition paradigm. Look, since the transition in Portugal, when the third wave of democracy commenced, there have been about 67 to 69 political transitions. Not all of them were successful. So the point is that there is sufficient knowledge about what contributes to success, what are the pitfalls for transition, that this is not something that we grope in the dark. We know what to do, we know what to avoid. There is a wealth of information, studies on this one. So we have the opportunity to use this opportunity that started as a groundswell of political protest, unseen in this country. To be sure, unseen in Africa itself. To be sure, I don't think that there is a revolution from below that succeeded by using the social media, by connecting movement within the country with transnational politics, succeeded in ushering in an opportunity, and this is an opportunity for a political transition in this country. So what I want to talk is to try to situate where are we in this transition, in the transition paradigm. The first thing that I want to talk about is the origins of the transition itself. Now, for a quarter of a century, since the violent transition of 1991, the EPRDF has ruled Ethiopia as a dominant party. The revolutionary democracy ideology and the organizing theme of the party was designed to establish a developmental state that will keep winning elections to stay in power until 2025. I think that was the program, until Ethiopia has become a middle-class economy. While the aggregate growth in this country points to some kind of change in general, what happened was 10 years to the point of destination, that is 2025, when the country has become a middle-class economy, then we will have a democracy. If you think that I am really making this up, read what Mr. Meles Zenawi was writing in this one, that we should sequence this. What we need is development first, and that would what ensures success to a democratic order. So development first, and then democracy. But in 2015, a decade before the target date of 2025, Ethiopia was engulfed by a massive popular unrest in the Oromia region. Initially, the protests in the Oromia region and then spread to the rest of Ethiopia, they demanded constitutionally guaranteed democratic rights. The demands centered around questions of land, identity, and self-rule. But they were simply demands for constitutional rights to be protected and democratic rights to be respected and human rights to be observed. That's basically what it was. That went on during the protest until the Erecha massacre. I call it massacre, if I'm not wrong, forgive me about that, but what happened in 2016 really changed the dynamics of change within the country. What you heard on that day in Bishoftu is that the demand for constitutional rights or democratic rights shifted from demanding the overthrow of the government itself. The whole order was transformed from 2016, October 2016. Because what we heard, the slogan of the young man that got up to the rostrum, what he said was, if you remember, down, down with TPLF. What that simply suggests is, this is not really demanding political rights to be observed. This is really a demand for the downfall of the government. That was another change. A state of emergency was imposed, hoping that the leadership of the Cairo movement might be captured if you throw a wide net, that some of them might opportunistically be captured. About 150 to 180,000 young people were herded to concentration camps in this country. Sure, when you cannot find the leadership of the Cairo movement, when you think that this is a ghost that is ruling it, well, it's justified for a government to try to round up everybody, hoping that some will be netted out in the state of emergency. You know what happened after the state of emergency. The violence that was unleashed is known. But what I remember is that after the state of emergency was removed, the protest actually came back roaring with greater intensity and more sophistication. So imposing a state of emergency one more time, again, as you all remember, the day the second one was imposed, it was nibbled to extinction. It did not work. Violence did not work in this country. That is what led to the EPRDF to really examine their approach. That if violence is not going to work, they had to look into themselves. So that is the origin of the movement itself. Now, that is the origin of the protest movement that led to the change that we're talking about. Second point that I really want to talk about is the transition, the feature of the transition. Because of the wealth of information or data that we have, there is a theory of political transition today, namely the transition paradigm. It has three components that transitions could take one of three routes. One is reform, the other is compromise, and the third is overthrow or a revolutionary upheaval. I try to situate Ethiopia's political transition in this mode of political paradigm. Reform means that the incumbent regime takes the lead in the transition to democracy. Given the weak opposition forces in this country, the ruling elite has total, in that situation, the ruling elite has total freedom to choose the course of transition. The old government itself, the one that is leading the transition, may choose to put an end to the authoritarian regime and shape the course of the democracy that will emerge at the end of the transition. This is not the path the Ethiopian transition has taken. The incumbent does not lead. You can ask this question about that, but I don't think the incumbent government actually leads the reform endeavor. Rather, it's focused on accepting the fait accompli. That if they do not bend, if they do not bend to the will of the protesters in the Oromia region, in the Amhara region, in the Gambela region, the choice was they were looking into the abyss. It's not a choice. So this is not, reform is not what the government chose. So that is not the path that they have taken. This was their force. It's amazing to me, like at least 5,000 protesters were killed. 40,000 political prisoners were released in the Oromia region alone. 40,000 political prisoners were released in the government. This is by the government, the regional government's own admission. Imagine that. 40,000 political prisoners were released. So the government had no choice but to yield to the protesters' demands. The second modality is compromise. It arises when both the incumbents and the opposition groups equally matched and come to the realization that they need each other to lead the reform movement. This hasn't occurred as well. This is not the Ethiopian case. The political players that matters as opposition force in this country are not the organized political groups. It is the Cairo movement and the other movements that actually led this revolution. There is no match between the government and the opposition forces which has led to a compromise. So this is not also the path that was taken. The third is the overthrow of the revolution. This is typical of authoritarian orders, that they oppose reforms. If they oppose reforms, the option is total upheaval and a violent overthrow of the governing party. This too is not the path that this transition has taken. Many tend to suggest that the appointment of a new prime minister is a peaceful transfer of power, but we all know that that's not the case. Still, the incumbent is in power. It has shuffled the deck. New prime minister is in power, but this is not a peaceful transition that had occurred in this country. All right, because I am now being told that I have only 5 minutes. 5 minutes and 4 now. Okay, here is what I want to say. Marina Ottaway, incidentally, someone who's an expert in Ethiopian politics, says that a situation where a transition stalls, a transition, instead of going forward, it stalls. She calls it a semi-authoritarian, permanent semi-authoritarian system coming into place. Here is how she defines what semi-authoritarian regime is, and I'm going to read it very quickly. Semi-authoritarian regimes are not imperfect democracies struggling toward improvement, but regimes determined to maintain the appearance of democracy without exposing themselves to the political risk that free competition entails. They allow little competition for power, leaving enough political space of political parties and organizations of the civil society to form, for an independent press to function to some extent, and for some political debate to take place. Now, at the core of the semi-authoritarian states lies a mechanism that effectively prevents the transfer of power through elections from one incumbent leader to another. This is when a transition really stalls, and there is probably a danger of that in this transition as well. There are reasons why I say that. There are instability of it, but we will talk about the structural problems. So I will skip and then conclude by saying, by addressing this idea of the element of choice in transitions. What that is that the actors, the political actors that have interest in the political success or failure of the political transition, make an element of choice. There are structural factors like economics, like socioeconomic situations, or political choices. But what I'm talking about here is the choice factor, the choice that leaders actually make could determine the success or failure of political transition. According to René Lewonchon, he identifies 3 variables that are integral components for transition. That is, the nature of the transition bargain. The second is the quality of leadership skills. The third is the characteristic of the opposition movement. As noted, with regard to political bargain, that hasn't occurred here. There is no political bargain still here. The opposition and the government talk to each other, they dine, but they don't sit down and hammer out the roadmap of this transition. That has not occurred. The bargain, the nature of the bargain determines the success or failure of democracy, or transition to democracy. This has not occurred. The second is the leadership skills. Whatever you might say, and people might not like what I probably would say, that I do not see that element of choice, the leadership skills that would be important, the incumbents to shape. There is, I think, there is a capacity, inadequacy in terms of the capacity to create the will and the national resolve for demonstrated transition to democracy. The skill is not there. I don't see that in terms of the articulation of the transition, the goals of the transition, a roadmap to transition, timeline to transition, or the goals of transition. That has not occurred. The third is the opposition. The third is the nature of the opposition. We all know that. The opposition is important. If this transition were to conclude, the logical conclusion would be free, fair, and competitive elections. That is where you could say, yes, the voice of the people have been heard, the voice are heard, and then at that point you could say this transition has succeeded or failed. If that doesn't occur, where you have free, fair, and competitive elections, transition might not happen. The opposition must get its act together to try to be competitive, and the government itself also should be able to level the playing field for others, so that the people of Ethiopia have the opportunity to make their voices heard, at least for a change. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
The topic of my presentation is the transition to multi-party democracy in Ethiopia possible? What are the comparative lessons? It's not a presentation per se, but I would like to raise some questions that I think will help us capture the challenge associated with democratization in Ethiopia, with a view to move a step forward from where we are right now. I make some 6 brief points by way of framework for discussion, and then hopefully we will have time for questions and comments. First, on the concept of transition that the scale briefly mentioned quite a number of times. It has been in use, the concept itself has been in use for almost 3 decades now, and was popularized following the US, following Samuel Huntington's third wave, and the enthusiastic democratic promoters in the early 1990s. The basic assumption of the concept is that countries will move from authoritarianism or dictatorship to democracy, and the interim period is what is called a transition. The reality on the ground, however, shows that this approach is too simplistic, inaccurate, and even sometimes misleading. What we have in reality is that a few ones have made it from Latin America and East Europe, South Korea also, for example. A few ones have made the transition straight from authoritarianism to democracy, while many others tragically have failed. I think we know quite a lot of them. Some have retained the name transition forever and has made the transition concept quite meaningless. And many more remain in what Thomas Karatos, in a widely quoted article in 2002, has labeled it what is called a gray zone. And this gray zone is given different nicknames: pseudo-democracy, electoral democracy, quasi-democracy, etc., etc. I mean, the names are quite plenty. It will take 15 minutes itself to all of them, or a liberal democracy, sometimes as it's called. And those in the gray zones have not made it, perhaps because they have lost their connection flights on the plane to democracy. You would see that the gray zone actually includes a large number of countries. The point I'm trying to make is this: hosting an authoritarian regime or its collapse does not automatically translate itself into democracy. This is very critical. In the worst of cases, as it happened in 1974 revolution in Ethiopia, it may even end up only changing an old master by a new one. So we have to be very careful of this juncture. And the question that I'm trying to raise is, how do we avoid this scenario? Is the first question that I pose to you, the audience, and the different political leaders we have here. The second, and this is, I think, is a very fundamental one, is related to what Dankwa Rostow, some 15 years back, in a much quoted article discussed about the genetic question of democracy, which nobody has refuted it so far. How does democracy come into being in the first place? From the comparative literature, it appears repeatedly, and I think it's basic to Ethiopia, that the first key entry point to democracy is related to the idea that democracy is rooted in the human being's innate capacity for self-government as a political community. It's a political system that allows citizens to elect their leaders through free and fair election, to have a say and influence on policies, and more importantly, popular control of the government. This assumes that in the political community, the existence of a broad consensus, a deliberate agreement, a pact, a commitment among political leaders, political elite, and more broadly among the population, on the idea that democracy is the only rule of the game to come to power. This remains a hard truth, critical truth, and the question is, if so, are we as a political party leaders, as members of political parties, and as people in general, convinced persuaded that this is so in Ethiopia. This is a critical gateway to democracy, and we cannot have democracy when a country has a significant number of armed rebel groups in or outside the country who still think that power comes through the barrel of the gun. The new development and the effort to bring all political parties and civil society leaders from exile back home is in many ways a step forward in this regard, and we hope that different political forces will stick to it and we don't repeat the same mistakes we did for over the last 4 decades. I want to emphasize this point, and maybe if time permits, I will try to explain it later in Amharic. The point that I'm trying to make is there are many authors who provide different kinds of preconditions or requisites for democracy, blah, blah, but I think the key question is if we, as a community, as a political community, have reached a state where there is a consensus that the only way to come to power should be through democratic election, that we have to be persuaded about that. And of course, political forces don't easily buy that, and I'm going to explain the next point, which has a very relevant point to explain to that. In relation to the upper point, what we can say, what can we say to the culture of our people who love buying and carrying arms everywhere? How do we transform this culture, and how do we transform and persuade the armed groups to abide by the rules of the game? Popular and elite support for democracy means that democratic rules are accepted as norms. Anti-system parts are weak or non-existent. And more importantly, authoritarianism is rejected wholeheartedly. This, I think, is a fundamental question for us, and it's called the genetic question of democracy because it determines the gateway and the answer to the question, how does a democracy come into being in the first place? Where do we stand in this regard? Again, this is a question. To be sure, rebel and armed forces and those left out are not going to accept democracy as the only rule of the game unless the system is ready to concede on some fundamentals or at least on certain bare minimums. So it's very much linked to what is called in the literature a political settlement. Political settlement is also very critical in the process of managing transition. Managing a transition following an end of civil war or a political crisis is difficult, but it's a very important moment. What are the rules of the game? Who are the actors? Who should be in? What will be the role of the armed groups and the different political forces? What is the roadmap that Professor Scale emphasized? What is the roadmap? And the process also to end the transition. Experts often refer to 3 separate but interrelated concepts, and I think this is also very critical if we want to understand, because I think we still have 2 years before the next election. Peace deal, a political settlement, and a constitutional design, or a revision, a substantial revision of an existing one. These are usually the 3 important components for the transition to be smooth. At times, they all happen at once. In other cases, each may happen separately, one following the other. There is also the chicken-egg problem of whether one precedes the other, but in reality, it's a much more complex process. Peace deal is the formal or informal agreement to end violence among the rival groups and to address the root causes of the conflict. The agreement to end violence cannot, however, be realized without some promise of power sharing or some kind of concession during the transition. Political settlement thus refers to the agreed framework following a negotiation that provides the roadmap on how power is going to be exercised or is going to be regulated during the process of transition. The leaders of the rival groups, and I'm referring here to serious political forces who have demonstrated support from their own communities and who usually sit and negotiate with the government, as was mentioned earlier. Understand here, the Prime Minister Dr. Abiy has, in his visit to the United States, has indicated that a return to another transition is out of the choice, and that his government is committed only to conduct a democratic election in the state. The key issue is whether the transition that we are having right now and in the coming 2 years is going to be inclusive enough to bring all relevant parties. Failure to do so would imply that left out will continue to threaten the system, making it fragile or calling for a new negotiated transition. It's also linked to nation building. An inclusive transition has a tendency to enhance the sense of we belong to a system that has a potential to cement the political process. In few countries, as part of the political settlement, they enter into a pact with some concessions between the outgoing and the old regime, or among the political forces that are in the negotiation circle. Those assuming power to facilitate a smooth transition or safe exit possibly. If we relate on our own experience of the recent history, the Derg thought it can marginalize some section of society, and that section of society dismantled the regime in 1991. The PRF too thought it can marginalize some section of society, except of course in 1991 and 1992 where we had more or less inclusive coalition government, although it was not elected, and in 2005 also. But we know where we are right now. 100% win and a one-party show, in the words of Marina Otoe again, which she named it as a crude formality which is devoid of content, ended up in where we are right now. The lesson is we can only succeed if we have a workable political system that is inclusive, broad-based, and a negotiated one. And I think this is the roadmap that Professor Skier was referring to. Don't leave out, my advice is don't leave out any significant political force. It will come back. It's a matter of time. And I think we have enough lessons from our previous political history. To keep the different political forces at home and within the framework, let us build institutions of democracy, and those institutions that are vital for conducting free and fair elections as well as for ensuring political freedoms. These institutions serve like an insurance system that guarantee during political loss the same way an insurance policy serves in time of risk. And like an umpire in football, where the rules of the game are agreed and set in advance and then strictly implemented impartially. Alas, let alone the political umpires, even our football players and umpires have miserably failed to ensure fair play. And football has become politics by other means. What shall we do here again is a question that I pose to you. Next, I think, is a challenge associated with institutionalization of power and how it affects democracy. I stand to be corrected, but my view is that, as in many parts of Africa, we have not been able to conquer power. We have not been able to institutionalize and regulate political power. Whoever wins power has the army, the police, the executive, the civil service, etc. in its hands, and has used this power for good or bad purposes. In Africa, including our country, Ethiopia, the adage has been that, has captured very well, the adage was captured by Michelle Aron, where she writes a book on Kenya, and I quote her, it's our turn to eat until somebody comes in and eats his or her own turn. We have to agree to end this saga. The developed world, realizing the dangers of unregulated power and having seen the many revolutions, the two devastating world wars, concluded decisively and more or less institutionalized power by dispersing it in many centers and through a system of check and balances, and democracy is more or less functioning. There you find real parliaments, real media, not nominal ones like ours, that ensure democratic accountability, the rule of law, human rights, and more importantly, judicial review of political system, mainly in the form of constitutional court as an institutional safeguard to shape the behavior of political actors and political institutions. I think this is very critical because it affects the democracy directly. The trend in Africa, including Ethiopia, with a few exceptions, has been that power has controlled us. We have not been able to control power. Let us first conquer power and then regulate or institutionalize it. Unregulated power is antithesis to democracy. Let's face this bitter truth and do something about The last one, it's now clearly established that the global trend in support for democracy over the last years is declining, and it's not on the rise. To add paint injury, China, Russia, Iran, Turkey are not watching idly. They are appearing as alternatives. Support for the mainstream political parties is getting low, while the support for far-right populist parties is increasing. Whatever the reasons are, mainstream political and class-based political movements such as liberalism, the usual ones, conservatism, social democracy, etc., is being threatened. And for this, you would like, I recommend to read the new book by Amy Chua, very known American political writer in Yale University, in her new book called Political Tribes. It's a new book, so it's very interesting. She explains very well why this is happening. At home, too, I argue that ethno-nationalism has reached its peak. We know what has happened during the cold red terror and white terror, what has happened in Oromia and Somali border, Sidama, Walaita, in Hawassa, etc., etc. These are not favorable conditions to democracy. But again, comparative lessons, and here India and Switzerland are handy, that unless we build social capital that crosses ethno-national and religious boundaries or related cleavage, ethnic conflicts and elite fragmentation are destroying the social fabric in society, and one cannot even have a country that alone build democracy in this context. We need to have a clear vision on our common destiny, on our shared values, and we need to have a vision that is bigger than the component parts, whatever the component parts are in this situation. We need to note as well that there is no one type of democracy in Ethiopia, and therefore, because of time, I will not go to the details, but I believe that the UK or the United States type of majoritarian democracy does not necessarily fit into our context, and I hope that the discussions will address the type of democracy that fits the Ethiopian context. Because I believe the country is a country of minorities, and inherent in our political system for the last how many years has been the rivalry for power between the different political elites. And I think there are relevant models from the developed world that we can use to address our problems. 1 million. The last one is the political culture, and I think the political parties I assume are here and listening, including the ruling party and the opposition. Political culture and the ever-increasing number of political parties is something that deserves mention here. I cannot detail here the reasons that led the white terror and the red terror, the tension between those that chose Ashkenazi to Ashkenazi, or vice versa, nor can I mention the discussions related to 2005 political crisis.